This is Samsara Audio, where we host conversations on religion, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. I'm Matthew Stanley, your host. Thanks for tuning in. This past week, I had the opportunity to sit down with Daniel Tutt, a Marxist and psychoanalytic theorist who I've followed and benefited from greatly. It was a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss his new book with him, titled How to Read Like a Parasite: Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. In his book, Tutt worries that we've applied an hermeneutics of innocence to Nietzsche, taking his concepts about slavery and cruelty and turning them from concrete political actions into metaphysical principles or philosophical genealogies. He works to resituate Nietzsche in his political context, where there were socialist and Marxist movements for equality, and then he was an explicit antagonist of these movements. One thing that really came out in our conversation that I plan on studying more is the necessity of active leisure for the production of culture and difference, and how this was central to both Nietzsche and Marxist thought. I hope that you will join me in welcoming Daniel to the podcast this week, and I hope that this interview benefits you as much as it did me. Welcome back to Samsara Audio. This is Matthew Stanley. We are recording on the first day of Lent. If you haven't practiced Lent before, I recommend giving it a try. It's interesting to give things up for an extended period of time. Anime is kind of one of my traditions, giving up. That's going back a while. Whatever you're giving up this year, go ahead and post it in a comment. I'd be curious to hear about whether you practice Lent or not. Anyways, we're hopping into a conversation with Daniel Tutt. He's somebody I've followed for a while now, a Marxist thinker. I believe he teaches political science at George Washington University. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel. But he's somebody that I really appreciate his perspective. I've followed his content for a while, as I said, both video and on Twitter. And when he announced that he was coming out with a book on Nietzsche, I knew I had to read it because I've been a Nietzsche fan since college, but also I really appreciated that he was taking on the task of trying to understand how Nietzsche had such a complicated relationship with the left, to see leftists taking up Nietzsche, and yet there are things in Nietzsche that are sort of profoundly anti-left as well. And I was interested to see how he worked through that, and so I picked up the book, I read it, and we are here to have a conversation about his latest book, How to Read Like a Parasite: Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. Daniel Tutt, thanks for being here.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for that opening. I teach philosophy at GW, but also at other places as well. Like the position is called professorial lecturer, so it's kind of a post where I teach periodically. It's actually a great arrangement. I love teaching at GW, but I also teach at other places as well. And I do, as you kind of intimated, I do a lot of stuff through my own podcast called Emancipations. People can check that out if they're interested.
Yeah, I'll link everything in the show notes, and I'm personally a Patreon supporter of Daniel, so I recommend checking out his stuff. Let's just dive right in. Daniel, I really appreciated this book on a broader note of, it felt like the work of somebody who had fallen hard for Nietzsche at some point in his life and then was deprogramming himself. Could you kind of get into that story of like, what was that deprogramming process? I kind of get this strong sense that you're pulling yourself out of something that you fell into.
A little bit, yeah, that is certainly a part of it. It's always hard to know where to begin when speaking of a thinker of the magnitude and of resonance of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche teaches us that one only does philosophy in a biographical mode. That's an essential lesson of Nietzsche, which sometimes Nietzscheans actually forget that point. That's not to say that Nietzscheanism is a subjectivist philosophy. It's not. It also has a metaphysics as well. But a lot of Nietzsche is a fusion of a certain style of writing that's quite poetic, that is biographical. Nietzsche is a writer of short aphorisms. Nietzsche is a writer that is taking on a whole range of characters in the world of thought and ideas. And that's part of the reason why young people learn a lot about history, about philosophy, about psychology, about religion by reading Nietzsche, about the ancient Greeks, right? So Nietzsche gives, and has since he died 120 years ago, he's given young people a bibliography, right? And he's also given young people an aesthetic of what it means to be an intellectual. And therefore, when you are a Nietzschean, you can be a Nietzschean kind of apolitically. You can be a Nietzschean of the right. You can also be a Nietzschean more of the left. So it comes in different forms. At the same time, there are certainly commonalities. There are certainly commonalities that come from this incredibly playful and incredibly erudite and interesting stylist. I mean, he's definitely one of the best prose stylists, in my opinion. He's not necessarily a good poet, but whatever you call the kind of writing that he wrote, it's cryptic, it's esoteric, it is proleptic. So he's trying to invent a community to come. I write about this a lot in the book, right? And in the history of the left, in particular, Nietzsche has been oftentimes more popular at the everyday level because Nietzsche does not only attract academics or academic philosophers. Nietzsche actually wrote about how his followers should be beyond academic scholars, which is a lesson that is in the post-war, after the Second World War, is not usually honored by a lot of Nietzscheans because there's a great irony, which is that Nietzscheanism has a sort of passionate set of followers within academia, right? And so there is a certain elitism that a lot of Nietzschean communities, including academic Nietzschean communities, can put forward. But in truth, Nietzsche is for the masses, and he always has been, because Nietzsche was such a deeply political thinker. Part of what I try to show in the book, of course, is that Nietzsche's political thrust to his writing is so deep because Nietzsche was trying to engage in a kind of polemical dance with the movements of what we today would call leftism during his time. And that was primarily actually socialism, right? Because Nietzsche was born 4 years before the Revolution of 1848 when Marx and Engels penned the Communist Manifesto, right? Nietzsche wrote his first major book where he very negatively references the communists and the anarchists that took to the streets in 1871 in the Paris Commune. So from the very get-go, from the very beginning, Nietzsche has a strong polemic against the movements for equality in his time. Those movements of equality are different than the movements for equality today. In some senses, they were like, suffrage, male suffrage. All men did not have the right to vote, for example. The abolition of slavery. Like Nietzsche was opposed to both of those things. So he's a thinker politically of the right. But because he is esoteric, right, the left will read him and say, wait a second, actually, what this thinker is, the problems that he's bringing out, right, are something that transcends right-left division and which we must take seriously. And I think that that's a valid point. We can talk about where the left goes too far in Nietzsche, in their Nietzsche addiction. But anyways, I'm going on a thread here. But yeah, I was definitely seized. I mean, speaking personally, and I apologize for that little digression, but speaking personally, yeah, Nietzsche made me kind of want to be a philosopher, because I wanted to have the same kind of capacity of criticism that he has. I wanted to just imagine for a second if you could, see, part of the thing with reading is that if you read something that's very great, you also want to produce something that will have a similar effect. So you see, that's the seduction part of what he's doing, right? And I think I've never really let go of that. I've always seen him that way as a very successful figure. Then comes a lot of other questions, right, about this community that he's trying to build, and also, frankly, history. What is the history of Nietzsche? What actually? How do we situate him? And a big focus of my book is to treat Nietzsche not as a timeless, ahistorical thinker, but to actually situate him in his time. As you know, this is a big focus. And I think that he looks and feels a lot different when you do that.
I can totally resonate with your experience. What you're talking about is like Nietzsche makes you want to be a philosopher because of how great what he wrote was. I loved the point that you started out with, is that he's a community building philosopher. I'd never thought about it that way, of the way that he constantly refers to us and to we, and calling for particular followers, even explicitly describing what type of disciples he wants, is this mechanism for engendering in you this, like, it's almost like he's nagging you a little bit, which is very interesting. And so you kind of want to rise to the challenge and be a part of whatever this special group is that he's making. So I I had never heard it put that way, but once you described it, it immediately was like, that's what's happening. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a funny feeling when, well, first of all, as a man that has a great admiration for religion, such as yourself, and theology, right? One of the things that I think is fair to say is that what's going on with Nietzsche, right, is a type of St. Paulinian structure, okay? Why? Well, because even though Nietzsche attacks the priests, and even though Nietzsche attacks asceticism, okay, it's fair to say that what he's really calling forth is a kind of new asceticism in which the followers break from convention. This is why Nietzsche can be used in a quite militant and radical way by the left, because he is advocating for dissociation and breaking of communal ties. Now, this obviously goes back to the genealogy of morality, right, in which sovereignty is talked about through the creditor-debtor relation. And so one of the kind of practical outcomes of this is actually, if you see like Foucault and Deleuze in their interpretation of Nietzsche, is actually to think of human freedom, okay, as a way which is beyond the contract, right, which is beyond institutions in some sense, right? And that, these French interpreters of Nietzsche on the left will take that insight really, really far. And part of what I kind of argue is that from like an ethical, or even like from the standpoint of virtue ethics, what Nietzsche's creating, the community that he's creating, has actually been quite deleterious and damaging for the kind of politics that I think we need. So that's a big debate that I have, that there's a kind of unhinged militancy in Nietzscheanism. Like, for example, some Nietzscheans on the left will say communism, okay, in the future, after we have seized the mode of production, should not be formulated on a commitment to rights, like human rights, okay? And that actually comes from Nietzsche's critique of the French revolutionary tradition itself. So you get a paradox happen, whereby the great tradition of the French Revolution, which put forward what's called the rights of man, right, that whole tradition, which put forward the idea that man's inhabitation in the world is to be understood through a telos, right, that there is the possibility of the achievement of certain universal goods within the political community and things of that nature. Nietzsche tears all of that down, right? And I think that in so doing, that becomes, on the surface, very radical seeming, but actually at a deeper level, there's some issues that I have with it. I'll just stop there. But you've evoked so many things in me that I start to go in different directions.
Well, I want to just take a very brief digression. We can control our time, but I do want to get your thought about rights, because you brought them up, and I definitely, as somebody who is a Christian, like Christianity definitely had a major force in bringing about rights and the victories that's brought, and for freedom in all types of people groups. And yet I do think that we're running up, it's almost like an idea that has like run out of its usefulness, and we're running into the contradictions of it, at least is my observation. I'm worried about certain things in the rights, like human rights theory, about the fact that these things need to be, like rights need to be endowed. And so it's like, who's doing the endowment? Where are the rights coming from? And when we formulate rights as a demand, we find ourselves firmly in the psychoanalytic sphere. And so I'm wondering, would you be able to take just a few moments to talk about the rights framework, whether you would continue to stake your political project on it, if you think that it is still useful but maybe does need to be superseded? Like, what are your thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is that socialists have always historically had a tendency to critique Nietzsche back when the workers' movement was at a level of significance at a global level. When we had things like really existing socialism, we had things like the International in their different iterations. Majority of people on the left perceive Nietzsche as a great antagonist to the project of building a rational society formulated on the foundation of collective group interests. Because it's not just rights that Nietzsche attacks. And Nietzsche also attacks the entire tradition of the Enlightenment, the radical Enlightenment, okay, that would submit to the notion that human communities can achieve like the instantiation of certain forms of universalism in the world. This is all to be sort of pretty aggressively denied by Nietzsche. And one of the things that really concerns me in that regard is Nietzsche's attack and his assault on consciousness. And this is an attack on Rousseau. It's an attack on Descartes. It's an attack also on Marxism, in my view. So I have a whole section comparing Nietzsche and Marx very closely in my book, okay? And on the question of religion, okay? Because you see, part of what Nietzsche wanted here was the idea of a society in which you have a pacified working class substratum that is not in a position to advocate for their rights. So that's the problem at hand, which is the Dionysian, right? The Dionysian is a kind of paradigm in which society can come into being, can come into existence on the backs of, and this is where Nietzsche's whole conception of the reinvention of slavery comes into play. And that's a quite troubling prospect, I think. So what the left Nietzschean runs a risk of, right, is sort of not fully investigating the scenario in which Nietzsche is a critic of rights and of the rights of man. And they kind of take a partial insight that he may have here, right, into some kind of abstract ahistorical idea, and they misapply it to the present. Because I think that if you are struggling for the development of collective liberation of a group, whether that be in capitalist society, that then introduces a new debate between liberalism and socialism about the status of suffering and the remediation of suffering. So if you have a class that uniquely is disadvantaged in capitalism, which is what Marx's proletariat is meant to refer to, right? Which is a class that has a unique form of immiseration that needs to be remediated, right? Which is still true today, right? Then in that case, if we relinquish a commitment and the tradition of rights, you see, Marx was always a longstanding proponent of increasing the rights of the leisure time for the workers. So if you could imagine like a contract for a worker in a social order in which the rights of the worker are marginalized, you can immediately see the danger that would come from that. I think what you're talking about in terms of rights is a slightly different problem, whereby a class can come about and make demands for rights which are from minoritarian or particular communities, and then force that on the majority, right? And then that becomes a kind of stranglehold of our body politic. And so people can see this in a whole range of areas today. Now, for me, I think that's slightly upstream from the bigger question, because you see the bigger question that Nietzsche is putting forward is a much more severe, destructive idea against universalism and the tradition of rights as such. So his critique is more thorough in this regard, and I don't think I don't really learn much from it, to be honest with you. I think if anything, we should be restoring the proposition that the left sees itself in the lineage of the radical Enlightenment. And then from there, because I think part of this also, by the way, is a question of the rights of speech, right? So if you incorporate the democratic, because Nietzsche was a huge critic of democracy. He's a huge critic of free speech as well, okay? He thought that the proliferation of universal education and of free speech would lead to communism. So, like, he has a very right-wing critique of these things. And I don't share those views. But at the same time, I will sympathize with your point insofar as I don't share the views of a kind of minoritarian, anti-democratic tyranny of imposing rights from on high, where you sort of circumvent democratic procedures in the name of human rights. Not to mention the problem of human rights and war. That's a whole other domain. So I'm sympathetic with your view, but I'm not prepared to discard rights to court. And I think Nietzsche is.
Something I'm hearing in what you're saying that I hadn't kind of thought about before is maybe like an argument would be that the Marxist conversation about rights is about is circumscribed to a very particular set of rights related to things like, it seems like slavery, like not being enslaved, and the argument is that wage labor is slavery, kind of sort of the modern manifestation of it. Things like debt, peonage, and then in your book you bring up again and again leisure time is something that Nietzsche wants to restrict to the elite. He doesn't want the masses to be able to enjoy leisure time. So it seems to me like maybe there's an argument to be made about like Marxists specifically saying like these are the core rights that are the foundation for everything else, and we need to stay focused on these ones. Because I think that where I'm coming from is what we have is a proliferation of rights that seem like the right to not be harmed subjectively, for instance, rather than materially. And so the search for rights is this continual production of new ways to create buffers and protocolize social life in order to prevent, trauma is kind of the common concept, but I mean basically just an encounter with another. And so I'm wondering if does there need to be an argument about like, hey, we're focused on these particular rights instead of just the continual project of radicalizing rights discourse to the point where it's people's right to receive sort of like the whole range of government services. Basically, the government and corporations and society needs to step in to provide everything to somebody. I think you understand the question I'm asking.
Sure. I mean, part of this is a question of the tradition of virtue ethics, I want to say, because like philosophically, I think Aristotle hovers over this debate a lot, right? Because the pursuit of the good life and the preconditions for achieving it, Marxism and Marx has a particular analysis of capitalism which does pinpoint the kind of primary schism that prevents freedom. So Marx is a thinker of freedom, often even over equality in some sense. That's a big debate about how we situate freedom and equality, which we can talk about in a moment. But with that said, there is a sort of, let's say, a presupposition in socialist and Marxist thought that because capitalism restricts the rights of labor for the expression on behalf of the vast majority of workers, because they are rendered into a reliance and a paternalism through commodification, okay? And in other words, they have to sell their labor for their existence, right? In that domain, in that regard, the task of politics is one of overcoming that bondage. Now, in the process there, Marx will have a number of debates on the left with other socialists about how we achieve the transcendence of this insidious form of reliance on market domination and wage labor domination. It's a relation of domination, and it therefore has to be transcended. Now, Nietzsche emerges in a very similar time period of Marx, and he has a very similar critique of wage labor. But the conclusion of Nietzsche's argument about wage labor is that the issue is if we do not pacify socialist agitation to workers, we will have a situation of decadence, we will have a situation of ressentiment, we will have a situation of envy, and this will paralyze Nietzsche's higher objective, which is to preserve the conditions for a great culture. That's kind of the core of Nietzsche's political argument and architecture. In fact, Nietzsche actually wanted to build monuments on top of the cave of Rousseau, so that Rousseau's envious philosophy can be covered over and forgotten. Nietzsche wanted the masses to forget about socialism, like a bad dream. And therefore, we can understand Nietzsche's critique of wage labor as a new form of wage slavery, as a new form of slave morality as well, okay? You see, that's the question of history, because we talk about Nietzsche's ideas, ressentiment, slave morality, And a lot of academic Nietzscheans, as I mentioned earlier, will have you think that really, in reality, he's talking about this historical genealogy. It's not immediately applicable to the present. But the title of my first chapter is We Live in Nietzsche's World. And I believe that's true in the sense that most of the major social and political problems that Marx and Nietzsche are talking about, that we are talking about, are still the primary problems of our time. So we have an elite liberal class that may be creating a crisis over rights, whether that be human rights in warfare, whether that be the rights of children, whether that be the rights of sexual expression, whatever it may be. A lot of that has to be understood through what I call political nominalism. Now, that's a concept I develop in the book, you may remember, where I argue that liberalism nominalizes the problems that socialists give to it. And so when I said that Marx has an idea of freedom built on transcending wage labor, that's not something that liberals are able to incorporate into their platform of rights. So what does that tell you? I think it tells you that they're going to go off from that and invent other problems, other areas. So they're never able to address this core thing, which is why Marx said that we need to be revolutionaries, because we need to be sober to that point. You see my point? Which is the ruling class will not address the primary schism that is the heart of so much. You see, it does go back to suffering in some ways. And that is why Nietzsche is such a important thinker, because Nietzsche is not afraid to place suffering really, I would argue, at the center of his philosophy. And again, that's something that a lot of Nietzscheans don't recognize enough, in my opinion, how much he talks about suffering. So I hope this is kind of getting closer to your very interesting question.
Yeah, I want to talk about that contrast between freedom and egalitarianism. It sounds fascinating, but I did want to just, before we get there, your point about living in Nietzsche's world, I think, was really apt and brought in a lot of interesting ideas in the book. Like here on page 272, you said, if we declare the incel to be of resentment, are we not just adding more fuel to the mythical fire that caused them to appear as such? What is needed is a total break from the myth that our society, in all its class domination and inequality, is at all reflective of a winner-loser dichotomy. What you were getting at in this final chapter, at least one of the sections, was that the idea of winners and losers, this story that Nietzsche is pushing forward, is actually not radical in our context. It's actually what everybody has psychologically internalized and is a source of oppression now, that when you experience yourself as not becoming this singularity, you experience yourself as a failure. And so there's a sense in which this winners-losers ideology that we have internalized is now a new source of suffering in our society. And you're kind of trying to chart the path towards a different description of the affects that are oppressing us today.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is an important part of the book for me personally, because I really feel that we have social problems happening today, like this problem of loneliness of young people, detachment from even being able to make friends. So there's a sort of deterioration in our social field, and we have concurrent to that a society which, because, and I really think that entrepreneurialism is partially to blame for this, in the sense that one of its guiding mottos is the idea that as entrepreneurs, the market determines this Manichean division. And so everything is therefore placed onto the market as what you might call an arbiter or settler of scores. And therefore, people relate to the market as a kind of truth, perhaps maybe even a cold truth. And therefore, it forms a kind of ideological common sense. And even furthermore, if you are somebody that's pointing to this ideological common sense and you're questioning it, you will actually come under suspicion. So therefore, our society is one in which if you do question this common sense, if you are like of the right wing or a very libertarian position, people may accuse you of being envious or resentful, right? So I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which people have literalized this problem. And I think that has had psychic effects on people. Now, at the same time, here's the important caveat. As a socialist, we must also address and abolish the myth that socialists have an interest in fostering a sense of complete mediocrity, or they are opposed to excellence. And this requires a careful reading of Nietzsche and his views on mediocrity as such. Because what you will find may surprise you, okay? And what I show in the book, what I argue in the book, okay, and I have not had one Nietzschean dispute me on this, by the way, okay? Maybe they will, okay? Which is basically that, look, Nietzsche was not opposed to the masses being in a state of mediocrity. In fact, it's better for him, okay, from a kind of social stability standpoint, that the masses actually do accept their lot in life as sort of, let's say, subservient. This goes back to the question of rights. It's the problem of who has permitted a subservient class to be in a position where they would assume rights. It's about creating the conditions where the assumption of rights is removed. Okay? Again, it's about the pacification. As a side point, just hold that point and listen to this. Here's an example of a positive way, once you understand that about Nietzsche, that one on the left can read Nietzsche as a great antagonist, in the sense that if you imagine yourself for a moment as somebody that was born into and witnessed people around you really struggle, right? Because of the conditions of their world. Perhaps, let's say it was poverty, or perhaps you were born on the wrong side of the tracks, and perhaps you witnessed people's hopes and dreams being removed from them by conditions not of their own choice, by conditions not having even to do with this winner-loser problem. Because you see, one of the things I say in the book is that part of the reason why we live in Nietzsche's world is because we already do have a class of people that aren't even allowed to play the game. So the question of the winner-loser mythology is kind of a middle-class mythology in reality. And that actually means that one of the things I call for in the book, right, is a new attention beyond this issue. And what I try to show is that people that are not allowed to play the game are not resentful from not playing the game. In fact, what I try to show is that, like, the working class by and large is not really in a condition of ressentiment or envy for the middle class. That's actually not the way that the class struggle is playing out today. It's not based on envy. I think that it's a right-wing mythology to think that it is based on that. What I rather show is that what's really productive for the left to engage with in Nietzsche is to allow for Nietzsche to flip his intentions in the 180 from where he wanted to take them. And I show that certain thinkers like Jack London and Huey Newton were able to kind of read Nietzsche and reverse Nietzsche in some sense. Where Nietzsche wanted to pacify the working class, some leftists will radicalize the working class. Because again, Nietzsche's such a sophisticated thinker about human suffering. If you follow him all the way there, you yourself will be driven mad by it, and you yourself will want to reverse what you learn. Right? Does that make sense? And I have specific examples of how people have done that, by the way. But what I'm trying to say is that Nietzsche locates the problem of resentment, number one, okay? And he has a prescription, okay? He says a lot about it, but most of his prescriptions is where the problem resides. If you follow Nietzsche's prescriptions, I think you basically result in a kind of conservative liberal kind of position. So I insist that we must avoid his prescriptions. But again, a lot of the people on the left, they don't avoid the prescriptions, and that becomes a problem. And I can share examples of why that's a problem. I hope we're getting close to your question here.
Yeah, this is great so far, and there's still so much that we could talk about in what you just said, but as I was reading the book, I found kind of it churning up for me a question that I feel like I keep coming back to when I think about the question of socialism and Marxism, and it's something that came out of my own reading of Nietzsche. And I mean, it does come from my background of growing up in a Christian community, being basically petit bourgeois. I did go to college. I was not a first generation college student, so I had this experience of coming out of kind of this. I'm kind of the type of person that Nietzsche would have been writing to, and so I experience a call and a sympathy with what he's saying. At the same time, I have a Christian background, and being somebody who follows Jesus, I'm not willing to go along with his prescriptions, like you're pointing out, of like we need a reinstitution of slavery and these sort of things. Like, to me, liberation and freedom is at the heart of the gospel message that Jesus brings. So I'm not willing to compromise on that, but I also want to go about it in a way that is in alignment with what I think will bring about true freedom. So that was kind of like a little bit of a prelude to my question about how do we square the circle of the relationship between egalitarianism, like equality, and things like excellence, of differentiation. How do you have excellence without the work of valuation? And valuation requires this differentiation between objects of, well, something can't be excellent unless it's in comparison to something which is comparatively less excellent. Otherwise, it's just a pure singularity. It can't be described or valued in any way. And so to me, I wonder about how do we go about instituting a freedom which is not a leveling like Nietzsche talks about, and instead actually becomes an ecosystem for people to begin to work on and work through and produce things of excellence that are truly great, which would require there to be things that are better than other things, for instance, And so to me, I find this continually a problem when I come back to socialism. Like, I don't find myself longing for egalitarianism. I don't find myself longing to be equal to other people. I want to be able to be myself, but realizing that being myself means I'm going to be better at some things than other people, and I should lean into those, and that means I can produce something that's better and special, make a special contribution because of what I've cultivated and also things I've just received that are beyond me. And that this differentiation, not just kind of pure Deleuzian difference and continual dispersion, but this is what makes life great, is this production of things that are excellent and beautiful. And how do we square that with egalitarianism, which to me kind of seems like this negative value rather than a positive value?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, well, first of all, in capitalism, money itself has a false equivalence, according to Marx. So money itself becomes the kind of site for the determination of a false equality already. And so we have built into capitalist social relations a kind of anathema, a refusal of equality. So the liberal order itself already refuses equality, especially in more recent forms of liberalism, what they call the neoliberal era. Right? I would argue, and I argue in the book, that there's a sort of wide-scale skepticism over equality. Now, that was actually not the truth of liberalism as Marx and Nietzsche encountered it. As Marx and Nietzsche encountered liberalism, it was a tradition that was still close to the bourgeois revolutions of the French Revolution in particular, in which egalitarianism was put forward as a political value, primarily to resolve the transition out of feudalism into capitalism. So capitalism ushers into the world historical scene on the backs of a universal call for egalitarianism, which was blocked and which was denied by the structure of the feudal order, we could say, right? And so in that sense, the age of equality, the age of what Nietzsche encountered after 1848, the age of revolution, right, became a problem because the intelligentsia, the liberal intellectual class, was becoming seduced by the idea of equality. But we have to understand the context by which we are discussing equality, because we're not discussing equality in the context of that I think we often discuss it today, which is this context of like you see, biological equality, IQ, genetics, that whole physiological tradition of equality. One important thing to recognize here is that part of the reason why the right wing really is attached to Nietzsche, okay, is because he was one of the first philosophers, political philosophers, to really incorporate physiology into a critique of equality. This is why Galton, Nietzsche read, and this is why the early eugenics movement elevated Nietzsche as a kind of prophet of early eugenics. Okay, is also why we have in Nietzsche a very, very sophisticated reading of Darwin and a very particular, frankly, right-wing social Darwinist version of political thought that comes out of Nietzsche. Okay, where the basic idea is not a mere critique of the egalitarianism of Rousseau, of the Jacobins, and of the radical elements of the French Revolution. No, the argument here is more that the movements for equality are eradicating the possibility of great specimens, great biological specimens for rule and for emergence. So it creates a kind of top-down world in which the truly great are repressed by the social power from realizing their greatness. Now, that's actually part of the psychology of the community of Nietzsche, because you can think about it. If you have a bunch of readers that feel that they are being repressed in this way from experiencing their greatness, you can immediately see how radical and militant they will become. But one of the things that I argue, and I have a review of some work on this coming out soon, is that, I'm not really in favor of dictating social policy or political policy on the basis of biological conceptions of equality. I think that a prior problem has to be addressed before we get to that, which is the sunk issue of the inequality born from wage labor in capitalism itself, and the problem of the distribution of private property as well, and the problem of the refusal on behalf of liberal powers today to remediate the harms of capitalism and the rapaciousness of it. You see my point? So in that way, it's that whole debate about equality that a lot of Nietzscheans bring out isn't interesting to me, because it doesn't, if anything, what I argue is that Nietzsche introduces new forms of inequality that the Übermensch need to then reintroduce. Because one of the things that Nietzsche says is that modern slave morality, okay, is born from the division of labor, okay? And he says that in the capitalist social order, basically, he argues that some people become incomplete, what he calls incomplete individuals, okay? And those incomplete individuals, this is where mediocrity comes into play, in reality need to be tested. They need to be thrown to, in how most right-wing Nietzscheans think of this is they need to be thrown to the market, that the market is a kind of natural corrector of their mediocrity. And I think for me, again, that is an evasion of social reality. And I think that it's too cruel and too disciplinary to insist on this market correction device as the determination of equality. It comes back to that for me. That's the problem for me, which is therefore needs a remediation of a man's relationship to the market needs to change. And for me, in a socialist society is about that. And that's where equality comes into play. Equality is not, I would still put freedom, okay, in the driver's seat when we have these big debates. But I think that what you're concerned with is a kind of bureaucratic equality from on high that would sap the dynamism. Because one of the other things that we can say here about singularity and dynamism and individualism, okay, is the fact that for Nietzsche, all of this, as it was for Marx, okay, and people often forget this, is derived from the cultivation of what I call otium, which is active leisure time. Okay, so culture and distinction, what you call differentiation, at a social level is only made possible by the cultivation of active leisure. This is something that philosophers have talked about for centuries. Okay, you find it in the Stoics, you find it in the Roman philosophers, and so on. Okay, But think about it this way. The world we live in really started in the 1830s with industrial capitalism, right? Like a great poet recently told me that there is no escape of Romanticism because Romanticism was born from the birth of industrial capitalism. And we're still with it in some sense, even though capitalism is very finance-based and so on and so forth. You see my point? So what I'm trying to say is that the question of distinction and difference is born from the necessity for a society built on the preservation of leisure. Now, my argument would be that a society that permits its citizens for maximization as much as possible, but not in some unhinged way, because I'm not an anarchist, okay? But a society that would permit large-scale expansions and experimentations in leisure on behalf of the masses would be a society in which you would actually, paradoxically, produce Nietzsche's end better, which is, again, art, culture, and human flourishing. Okay, so you see, we're almost brought back to Aristotle in some sense, but we have gone through Marx and we've said, no, Nietzsche's prescriptions are all wrong. Of course, he is correct about leisure, though. Okay, question is the distribution of leisure, the accessibility of leisure. That's the question that socialism will bring to liberalism. So we would have more excellence if more leisure was permitted. Let's just say, and this is my fundamental point.
I think that's a great argument. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. What I basically hear you saying is that it's not about equality as such, but rather it's about seizing the means of the production of freedom. Which is leisure. Active leisure is the means by which freedom is exercised, cultivated. It is, the production of culture comes about through the exercise of this activity. And so one of the primary kind of battlefronts is, how do you distribute leisure, the practice of leisure in a society?
That's right. Well, there's a lot there. I mean, there's a lot there because, on the one hand, like I was just talking to, let's just get very practical for a second. Like, let's just get, because we're talking about philosophical points, but we can also move to a more practical mode of thinking this through. Well, I mean, one of the things we've known about capitalism in like, say, the last 3 generations, from, say, the baby boomers till the Zoomers, okay, is that one of the striking things that's happened is that in the baby boomer period, okay, capitalism witnessed the rise of non-assertative marriage, okay, which was because the cost of living was low, because we had a social welfare safety net that allowed for class mobility. People that were born poor and people that were born like middle or upper middle class, they would often marry down and they would marry up and vice versa. That no longer happens anymore, right? So we have a society which is increasingly becoming stratified along the lines of class. And that's a fact. It's a quite traumatic fact, actually, because, we have a problem of a kind of what would a politics of nostalgia actually produce. And here Nietzsche is a great educator as well, in a slightly negative way, as always, which is, Nietzsche had a skepticism over any collective political endeavor that would be for the restoration of a lost tradition. You see, this is a very interesting point, because you see Nietzsche read Edmund Burke, okay, and he read conservatives that were pro-tradition, and he disagreed with them. So you see, he agrees with the implicit idea of like caste and hierarchy of, say, Burke, but he disagrees that we need to resurrect tradition in order to achieve that. That's what makes Nietzsche so different. You see my point? And also because, you see, he absolutely agrees with Burke on the anti-revolutionary focus. But he has a different theory about how to achieve that, right? So we're dealing with a thinker who is so deeply political, right? And and like, what is the meaning of that fact, right? That like capitalism since the 1970s has thrown people to the market in a way which has been quite damaging to our culture in a certain way. Because one of the arguments I would make is that when you have more leisure time for the masses, you actually do see a better cultural expression, that's a whole other debate we can get into about, it's not about representation, it's more about conflict and human self-expression. Because what are we after? We're after a world in which human singularity can express itself in its fullness as much as possible. That would be the question of egalitarianism. Is that general promise, like a social order that would be premised on this possibility? Now, that is an impossibility, or I'm sorry, that is a possibility built into the American Revolution, by the way. Incidentally, Nietzsche commented about this idea of happiness for all, very, very opposed to it, right? Which is a very interesting idea. Even going back to The Birth of Tragedy, his first text, he's deeply opposed to this notion. Because he saw in the premise of the American Revolution, right, that same universalism, right? He saw that version. Like, we may not read that as a particular appeal to equality, but I actually think that it is, and it was an appeal to equality. I wonder how you read that, by the way. But so I don't think we can escape equality so easily. You know what I'm saying? I hope that helps.
Yeah, it's bringing a bunch of things up for me, and I want to say one thing before I get to my next point, but what you just pointed out is about the American Revolution focusing on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think it's almost like we kind of got American egalitarianism instead of French egalitarianism, because we ended up with the world where you are free to achieve some sort of banal happiness, just like warm, fuzzy pleasure, but none of the actual concrete structures of freedom in existence. So America, the way that it was couched in the American Revolution, already had this kind of bourgeois subjective orientation where in the end you would just kind of get this booby prize that you'd be happy with rather than the real thing. So that was something that what you said brought up for me.
Yeah, it's a big debate, right? I wrote about this in my first book as well, about kind of American liberalism and the question of the fact that at the birth of the American Revolution, you actually did not have you had the problem of slavery. However, one thing that's different is that you did not have, as we did in Europe in their revolutions, a large contingent of an oppressed working class or peasantry. That's actually quite low by relative standards in the United States. So therefore, you're right, it does sort of.
Well, what's interesting too is you didn't have a historical aristocracy either, like a landed aristocracy. It was sort of like this massively leveled middle class society. Like everybody was sort of functionally middle class because actually the oppressors were across the Atlantic extracting taxes. Like in a way, you could see all of the colonies as just one giant factory. You know, where like in a way there's this colonial wage slaver relationship, but they just happen to be doing very well for themselves, such that there was really no sort of unlanded destitution amongst them. It was very rare.
Absolutely, yeah. This is very true. And then of course there's a wonderful historical argument that America eventually did develop a dependent working class that became a problem for its founding ideals. And then it became a question of the political myths that had to be invented to sustain the founding myths. Because that's actually another thing with Nietzsche that is important to understand when you read about Nietzsche in his historical time. When was Nietzsche writing? A lot of people don't realize this. But Nietzsche, when he was born, there was no unified German nation. It was 35 mini-states, okay? The very year that his first major book is published, The Birth of Tragedy, is when the Second Reich and the foundation of Germany begins. And part of what Nietzsche's in the cauldron of intellectual life at that time, with Wagner and with a whole range of other intellectuals at the time, the young Hegelians, Burckhardt, etc., was this question of political myths at the foundation of the nation. Implicitly, Nietzsche was in the debates about the national liberal, what they call national liberalism, okay? But curiously, he breaks from that, as I mentioned before with the Burke point, and he goes off in a slightly different direction to create his very unique and very idiosyncratic political agenda. But you see the point, though. It's that it's always a question in philosophy of the guiding myths of, I guess you could say in this case, of the nation, in some sense. And the guiding myth in the American case is, well, it's the myth of Horatio Alger, which is this idea that we can maintain an idea of bourgeois equality if we appeal to basically the idea of a meritocracy, which is everyone has the right ultimately to the pursuit of private property. Like I always say, FDR's New Deal was the single largest expansion of private property in human history. That was a socialist. We are told that was a socialist moment. It's not exactly socialism, but it was, though, at the same time, right? So what's the meaning of that? You see my point? And that actually remains the heart of the bourgeois project in American form, which is this idea of, you know, those are the rights, the foundational rights. And, of course, we see that also as globalization happens, as problems of capitalism proliferate, one of the hardest things for the social order, for the ruling class to guarantee, right, is this idea. We're always fearful that our children will not be able to own their own homes, that our children will not be able to have the resources to produce a family. So therefore, the rights of the American project, in some sense, are always in question. They always could be removed. They always could be taken away. It's always a question. And these things always draw me back to socialism as a sort of answer to this, because I think what I'm after is a society in which human flourishing and human stability, because you see, that's the other thing. This world we live in throws people to the market as a solution for its own social ills, as a recorrective device. But that's not the solution of opening leisure as the recorrective device, right? So like in a practical sense, I love this idea, by the way, just if we want to think about it practically, of a mandatory year of a complete exemption from having to work. I mean, why is it every time you get a job or you apply for a job, you are analyzed based on what you were doing every month of the calendar year? And if there's 1 or 2 months not accounted for, that possible employer will want to know exactly what you were doing. And if you were not working, that's a major problem for them. So that's a kind of norm that is enforced. But it's enforced, why? Through these capitalist imperatives to have a workforce that adheres in a certain way. That's an oppressive norm. I don't know if you agree, but I think that's oppressive.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this as we applied for a new apartment recently, and they want to know exactly where you've lived for the past 3 years and exactly who, you know, they're asking, like, who was responsible for this property, basically, and where were you, and we're going to call them and stuff. And it's just, it's fascinating that you find that it's that same structure recurs. It's like if you are deviating from the script in any way at all, as we've sort of defined it, we need to thoroughly analyze that. And by the way, this is the script. The script is, how did you relate to some authority structure, whether it's a bureaucracy or a certification or debt peonage?
Yeah. I know I'm opposed to this, right? I mean, I think, but again, we have a kind of rapacious bureaucratic state. It's obvious to me. In that sense, you see, Marxism is not in favor of re-entrenching bureaucracy in some sense. I think this is a kind of big misnomer from the specter of Stalin. This is another thing I talk about in the book, right? Which is, if we don't overcome that specter of what's called state socialism, right, we're not going to be able to fully understand how to reintroduce some basic egalitarian policies that would allow, like, why is it that in the United States they recently released a kind of law from the U.S. Congress which argued that the U.S. Congress is not permitted to talk about socialism. It was kind of like it was a resolution on the use of socialism even as like an idea in some sense. So that's quite pernicious. Like, so there's a certain sense in which if we let the market run the way that it has been going, we will have a society that is basically founded on this myth, speaking of political myths, of what I call the sadomasochist myth, which is the winner-loser myth. And I think that you can pretend that that myth isn't real. You can disavow it. You can say, oh, well, what we need is to train people not to internalize the world that way. But those aren't good enough for me, because what you need to change is the concrete material social possibility in the way that people come into their careers, into like this whole idea that every young person that doesn't have wealthy parents should be prepared to obligatory go into $100,000 of debt in order to get an undergraduate education at a school that will allow them to receive a job that is like of a decent pay. That's what it requires. So you see, in order to have true class mobility, look at the sacrifice that they force you to make. If you want to move from that to like a stable middle class life. But even, of course, a stable middle class life is not exactly stable. It's a real problem. Again, appeals to liberty and to the market are not adequate for me. There needs to be organization so that people affected by this can begin to advocate, because the people that are in power haven't been affected by this. They don't live it. It is a question of experience, I'm sorry to say, right? So for me, like these are the things that Nietzsche brings out. You see, this is why Nietzsche is such an important political thinker, because he provokes us. That's why this whole business of enemy is important. If you read a lot of Nietzsche, you'll see that Nietzsche encourages you to think about who your enemies are. Okay? Now, I know we got to be careful there, because we don't want to just start, willy-nilly calling people enemies. But I think with a careful reading of Nietzsche will show that if you are committed to the left, to socialism, etc., you should have no problem understanding that Nietzsche is actually an antagonist to your objectives. It should not be a problem for you.
Which, in good Nietzschean fashion, though, Nietzsche wants you to seek out good enemies. Like, that's what's interesting about Nietzsche, too, is like, he's going to say, yeah, you need to identify your enemies, but he also wants you to use those enemies as a way of getting better for yourself. Like, you need good enemies to get better yourself.
100%. That's exactly right. And that's why I always felt that people who don't treat him, like I was thinking like, people who say that Nietzsche is not an enemy, I always get very suspicious because I always think like, wait a second, you haven't really done your homework that well if you say that. And furthermore, you haven't like really become a Nietzschean, because Nietzsche's always saying like, you have to like fight me so much that you lose me. And that when you lose me, my message will come back to you. And that's actually true. Like, say this whole question on ressentiment. Part of Nietzsche, what he uncovers is maddening. So you do want to move away from him, okay? Not even at the level of what he prescribes, how to ameliorate problems, but also even at like the fact of what he's bringing out, okay? So you do have to. This is why it's always a dance. Like Nietzsche refers to decadence as a form of dance. And he always treats decadence itself as this, symptomatic cultural effect, as a question of how to dance with it, how to sort of become and overcome. This is also, I would even say, why Nietzsche has such a focus on overcoming sickness as well, convalescence, right? So he's a great polemicist. The subtitle of Genealogy of Morality is, right? A polemic. But he's esoteric enough not to really define who he's polemicizing against. It's very interesting, right? He's not saying it's a polemic against socialism. No, he's opening it up more. He's leaving that indeterminate.
It comes back to the community question, where you've pointed out that his goal is explicitly to galvanize an elite. And the way that he does that is by appealing to disaffected elites, sort of those who are downwardly mobile, those who are kind of looking in on the glass. Like, because I would suspect that actually like Nietzsche is not a particularly interesting thinker to like the truly wealthy, but it's the people who are the middle class strivers, or they grew up rich and they dropped out of it. Like those are the people that Nietzsche appeals to, I think. And it gets to this concept of aristocratic radicalism that you talk about in the book, where he's trying to galvanize the resentment in the aristocratic classes and kind of pit them against each other with the goal ultimately of reforging a new aristocracy.
That's pretty much correct, yeah. I would only push back on a couple points. One is Nietzscheanism, okay, is a contentious idea. The idea can be understood, I think, in a couple ways. The first is that through Nietzsche's philosophy, Nietzsche, for example, puts forward certain large-scale cultural ideas that have almost functioned as like viruses in our culture, like they've had huge influence. So like the question of Nietzsche and values, this idea of individual values, what are your individual values? Well, that actually is something that Nietzsche is really responsible for introducing to our culture. Obviously, this idea of atheism and his notion of the death of God has had a huge impact. So there's these kind of large-scale Nietzschean contributions. But then there's also Nietzscheanism. And that has a lot of different variations. For example, I'll give you a couple examples of Nietzschean communities. You can have communities in the Bolsheviks in 1917, the Russian Revolution. You can have Nietzschean communities in the Black Panthers, Black radical tradition. You can have Nietzschean communities exist within the incels, as we mentioned before. So he can appear in the alt-right, right? You can have Nietzschean academic communities. Now, all of those people are not necessarily defined by their class position, not necessarily. However, there is some commonality about that idea in the domain of radical leftism that is valid and that people have written about. Trotsky's written about this. There's been sociological studies about this. And what that actually has to do with is a kind of a tendency for the development of a certain cadre of counterculture leftism that is, in a certain way, interested in bohemianism, is interested in self-expression, okay? I'll give you an example. Very famous Nietzschean, left-wing Nietzschean, but he's an interesting thinker, Kurt Eisner. And Max Weber's notion of the charismatic personality, he was using Kurt Eisner as the example. Kurt Eisner wrote a book where he said Nietzsche is a great enemy to socialism, and kind of like my book in a way, in the sense that he's saying that socialists should use Nietzsche's ideas against him. Well, actually, it turns out Kurt Eisner created a bohemian socialist revolution in Bavaria in 1918 that for a short period of time seized the government. And he had a kind of bohemian government take over. And it was at that point that Max Weber said it's better, actually, that the bourgeois, not these bohemian leftists, right, rule. And that's actually a really interesting debate about Weber and Marxism. That's a point where Weber was against Marxism, because Weber didn't think that Marx's idea of dictatorship of proletariat, of working class rule, okay, would work, because he remained very technocratic. He basically said, no, we need experts, we need trained people, You see my point? So Nietzscheanism appears in this way, and I get into all of those different details, and I even get further into this point that it's really a question of reading methods. Because you can have left-wing Nietzscheans who read him like Eisner, but you can also have left-wing Nietzscheans like Gilles Deleuze. And I think that Deleuze is somebody that goes a little too far in the counterculture domain, and it becomes this kind of unhinged, rebellious leftism, and I have my criticisms of that.
One thing that I'm taking away from this conversation, and I do want to kind of begin to move things towards a close, is that odium, active leisure, like you've pointed out, really seems like the primary site of the contest that we need to hone in on. Because the reality is that communism is not anti-work. It's anti the wage-labor relationship. Whereas I think that communism, like a communist society, would be full of all types of work to do, you know? And so, and I'm not saying that you said that. I think that that's a common, just a misconception that I'm pointing out. And so the point is that what we're trying to get at is the producing the right ecosystem where meaningful work can be performed. And that is going to require also active leisure. And so one thing, to bring this to like a particular point, it seems like our leisure time that we currently enjoy, the shrinking window of whatever that is, there's a attempt by capitalism to conquer our leisure time as well. Like I think about Netflix, I think about sports, I think about all of these various sort of just consumptive activities. Like the goal is to colonize our leisure with consumptive activities rather than active leisure, because active leisure is that thing that could produce new ideas, differentiation, a new different perspective, new forms of community and social bonds,
and also social change. Because I mean, I think one of the things that we see is that if the working class is in a position where they are passive, that actually has a detrimental effect on the possibility of social change. That's a big argument that I make in the book. Okay, and paradoxically, Nietzsche helps us, let's say, de-pacify a given group. That's actually one of his contributions. And it's a paradox because he didn't really want that to happen. But you see, you can read him and you can sort of see how resentment might rigidify in a certain way and how it has to be overcome. And that actually goes back to my strategic argument that when we deploy the notion of ressentiment, actually Nietzsche had a design. I argue there's a design with that, which is it's meant to actually pacify. It's meant to kind of fortify a friend-enemy distinction. It's meant to kind of, like if I declare a group to be of a condition of ressentiment, I've kind of barred them from change. Well, that's exactly what Nietzsche kind of wanted, you see. So we need to do, in reality, we need to do the opposite of that. You know what I'm saying? We need to do the opposite of that. We need to depacify people. Political act, you know.
This connects to the point of the vitalist kind of stream of things on the right that we're starting to see more with, like Bronze Age pervert and all these talks about IQ and things like that. You're pointing out how the deploying ressentiment in that context is a way of mystifying what's going on, because you can't really, like, IQ is this attempt to quantify biological difference, but really if you actually look into the complexity of human populations and the human body, it is so hard to be able to actually distinguish human difference. Like we're still just figuring out why particular populations of people have certain propensities for certain diseases. We still have no idea how nutrition works. You know, like despite what institutions are telling you, there's whole communities of people just experimenting with nutrition constantly, and it's very difficult to figure out what's going on. So I think that this deploying this ressentiment and this appeal to the biological realm, it looks very radical. It looks very interesting. It's kind of edgy, but it is, as you've pointed out, a mystification of what's going on. And more importantly, it reifies people, like you're saying, that they can't change. It's biology. Of course, the funny thing about that is that what is biology other than change? You know, so like we're these mechanisms that are constantly adapting and changing and growing, taking in new things from our environment. We're constantly in this process of hybridity. And of course, you can take a snapshot of where somebody's at in that process, and certain groups have certain tendencies, but these are difficult to quantify and they're constantly under change. So I thought that that was really interesting because you didn't bring it up explicitly, but as you keyed in on the way that ressentiment was working, I noticed, oh, he's pointing out this trap that the right is falling into and that people are kind of getting suckered by.
But also the fact that we're not permitted to treat resentments that stem from the market sphere as legitimate. And I think that it's better that politics be about that to an extent. Let's put it this way. For me, an ideal scenario would be one in which people are permitted to exert complaint and resentments, but that doesn't paralyze them or bar them from the body politic, because that's actually more rational. It's more true. So therefore, it's a question of political expression and the repression of it. So I think politics should be about getting that more on the table so that problems of inequality can be seen in the light of day. You see, the market kind of conceals a lot of things in some sense. It really does conceal things in a certain way. And part of this also is generational. Because you see, the baby boomers, they didn't grow up with the same market inequalities that we have. So it's obvious that the forms of demands that they put out there in the world that are acceptable demands of politics, because politics is also about creating collective demands that are acceptable or not, right? Most of the demands that are acceptable were formulated at a time in which capitalism was far more equal than it is today. So we haven't caught up. You see the point? Right. And that's actually why the hysteria of demands today is based on that historical asynchronicity, if that makes sense.
Well, to point out, too, there hasn't been a leadership transition either. So those who are speaking out, pointing out hey, this is going on, the leaders are all people in their 60s, 70s, 80s who haven't stepped out of the role and done the work to mentor and bring up the next generation. So to them, these complaints do sound hysterical.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, I'm for the infusion of more rationality within politics so that collective interests and complaints can be more rationally diagnosed. Because I think that there's a psychoanalytic truth to a society in which, let's say crime, right, has the strongest correlation to stable work environments, or even we could say the problem of absent fathers. Well, this is part of the reason why my first book was on the family, not because of crime, you see, but because I felt that the left was actually not really able to talk about the full depth of the family experience. And in fact, there's a lot of areas and domains in which we're not permitted to talk about it. So that's always an interest for me. And this kind of stems back to the question on equality and rights. You see what I mean? Because capitalism produces some kind of hysterical situations, right? Some kind of maddening situations. And it produces people that can be quite aggressive, violent. It produces people that haven't sadomasochistic ideas. There's these satires like American Psycho with Bateman, right? And it's kind of it's a hyperbole, it's a satire, but there are some people that kind of are close to that. I mean, why is Donald Trump still revered despite the fact that he has done and said everything he's done? And I don't mean to be like a MSNBC liberal by saying that, but you see my point. He's it's a great contradiction of our system.
Thank you for being here, Daniel. This has been a great conversation. Everyone, I would recommend to check out Daniel's book, How to Read Like a Parasite. I personally thoroughly enjoyed it, gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. You can find a link to it in the description. Daniel, what are you reading right now to continue your line of inquiry?
Let's see. I really enjoyed Dmitry Safronov's new published book called Nietzsche's Political Economy. That goes into all of Nietzsche's comments on the topic of political economy. We often don't think of Nietzsche as a commentator on political economy. Remember that Marx's Capital was a critique of political economy. You see, Nietzsche also has a critique. So that's an important book of clarification about what Nietzsche says in that domain that really adds fullness to my work. The book by Jan Rehmann, who I've interviewed on my podcast on Deleuze and Foucault and their left-wing Nietzscheanism and how they kind of removed all of Nietzsche's politics in their treatment of his concepts, is a useful book to read in tandem with mine. I also am doing a lot of work outside of Nietzschean studies in the field of psycho thought as well as Marxist thought and the kind of intersection of those two. It's always a big question for me. Not so much how we align Nietzsche with Marx, but how we align Freud with Marx. I think that's a more productive, because I think that psychoanalysis offers this subjective set of truths for political life that Marxism proper often doesn't have. So that's why it's necessary to fuse those two domains. So I have a book project I'm working on that. I also have a book project on a Marxist philosopher who's been quite kind of marginalized, named Georg Lukács, and he's a big figure, as you know, in my Nietzsche book. And so I have a project that I'm working on him. Okay, those are the main ones, I guess. A few other things here and there. But yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I will link those books as well in the description. And I would recommend, again, Daniel's got a Patreon. He's active on Twitter, posts good content on YouTube. So follow him. You can stay up to date on what he's working on and find out about the next thing. So have a great day, Daniel. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate you being here and taking the time.
My pleasure. I very much enjoyed it. Anytime.
Excellent. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for listening to Samsara Audio.